Hello! Welcome back to another episode of The Delicious Legacy. I'm your curious host, Thomas Dinas, always hungry for ancient recipes from the underexplored past. On today's episode, we will be traveling to ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years before the time of classical Greece and Rome. My guest is Tate Paulette, an associate professor of North Carolina State University, who recently released a book called In the Land of Ninkasi, a history of beer in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, you know, I have done episodes about beer in the past. Most recently with Johnny Garrett about his book The Meaning of Beer, an Alternative History of the World. Or with Pete Brown, where we talked more about the global history of beer, or even when I was joined by Dr. Eleanor Janega and I talked about beer making in the Middle Ages and the role of women. And of course, the episode with James Wright about pubs, their importance and the myths around them in Britain. This is definitely a beer-soaked podcast. But there's never enough being said about beer. What are the newest evidence for beer making in the area we call today Iraq and Syria? What is the latest analysis of remains and experiments with brewing techniques like our ancestors did thousands of years ago? The opportunity to have an archaeologist of ancient Mesopotamia specializing in this specific subject in the region of the Fertile Crescent, in this land where beer was made by the great Sumerian, Akkadian and Babylonian civilizations, and also having a very recent book about it, it was something I couldn't resist. Tate's book has recently won 2 awards. The Felicia A. Holton Book Award from the Archaeological Institute of America, and this award is given annually to a writer or writers who, through major work of non-fiction, represent the importance and excitement of archaeology to the general public. And he also won the Nancy Lapp Popular Book Award, American Society of Overseas Research, an award that is presented to the author or editor of a book published in the last 2 years that offers a new synthesis of archaeological or textual evidence from the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, intended to reach an audience of scholars as well as students and the broader public. I will put links in the show notes for both these awards. And obviously I couldn't resist the opportunity to have him on the podcast. This podcast can only exist with your generous support, so please join me on Patreon from $3 a month and become a patron or leave a one-off donation at ko-fi, ko-fi.com/The Delicious Legacy Podcast, all one word. If you can't help this podcast financially, I totally get it. We live in precarious times. But if you love the podcast, do tell your friends and family about it. Share it with colleagues and send this episode via WhatsApp to 3 foodies in your life. Stay tuned till the end, as I'll be back with some news and my recommended food news or articles to read or listen to this week. Right, and with this, let's go on to today's episode. Dear Tate, welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
How are you? How have you been?
Oh, I'm great. Thank you.
I know it's early there now, but are you planning to drink any beer tonight?
There's a good chance, I would say. A reasonable chance.
Excellent. I like that. What is your favorite style of beer?
I guess if I really had to choose, I like many different styles, but I guess a sort of traditional English cask ale is probably my favorite. I also, these days, I drink a lot of sort of nice lagers.
Yeah, they're definitely much better lagers nowadays. But still, I prefer cask ale, I think.
Yes, that's my favorite. It's just very hard to get here where I am. So if I make my way to England, for example, that's all I'm having.
Excellent. To the listeners who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm an archaeologist. I currently work in a history department at North Carolina State University, but my primary training is in archaeology. I've done fieldwork in Syria, Iraq, Cyprus, Turkey, Egypt, Scotland, which is where I did my undergraduate degree, and then also in the US. So quite a lot of different field projects. I currently run an excavation project on the island of Cyprus.
Cool. What's in Cyprus that you're interested?
Well, my wife and I run it together, and it's basically a small village dating to the late Chalcolithic period and the early Bronze Age, which is in basically the third millennium BC. And I guess one thing that's really interesting to us is that, so we used to work in Syria until 2010, where we were excavating basically one of the first cities in world history, massive settlement, but dating to basically exactly this same time period. So it's really interesting to have this kind of comparison of really very different sorts of societies, not separated by not that much distance.
Yeah, they're not very far away. I mean, it's just across the coast, basically. Yeah, excellent. So you've been an archaeologist for many years, and you've been interested in Mesopotamia, and you worked there as well, ancient Mesopotamia. But you wrote a book about ancient beer, in a sense. So can you tell us give us a little bit of information about beer? What is beer in the ancient world, basically? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So I go with a pretty broad definition of beer. Maybe not everyone would agree, but I consider beer basically any fermented beverage made from a grain, and not a distilled beverage. But and so I like that definition because it gives us a sort of a common category where we can include both barley-based beers, like many of us are used to, but also others like maize beers and rice beers and sorghum beers. And so I think it's nice to have this kind of catch-all category. And it kind of links up to something that I always try to emphasize, which is I feel like there's often an assumption that beer was kind of invented at some point and then gradually spread out around the world. And many people would say it might have been invented in somewhere like ancient Mesopotamia that I study, or Egypt. And what I like to emphasize is that really, as far as we can currently tell, beer has been discovered many, many times, or invented, however you want to phrase it, in different places at different times, using whatever local grains were available. There might have been elements of a kind of spread. We're increasingly learning about the very early days of these beverages. And so it's possible that if beer was kind of a part in the ancient Near East, the region that I focus on, if it was a part of the Neolithic revolution, this major change in human life ways, that maybe as that kind of the Neolithic lifestyle spread, perhaps beer could have gone along with it. But I really don't think we have the data yet to make those kind of arguments.
Okay, so very interesting, because there's this debate going on forever, I suppose. Like, does it spread? Does people influence each other on how to make it, and who started this? And
sure. And I don't want to say that it didn't spread. And I just think that I think it's a great question, but it probably needs a lot more work. There's been a lot of work in the last couple of decades on these very earliest bits of evidence for different alcoholic beverages. So we're really learning a lot more about that, but they're still just sort of independent little data points where we have a site where organic residue analysis was done on residues kept in a number of vessels or other things. And so we can say, yes, this kind of beverage was present here, but we don't generally have enough data points to talk about something like spread.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, the analysis of archaeological remains, the organic materials, it's much better than like 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that evolution of discovering what happened in the past, it's much quicker, I suppose. And we find more new things all the time, which is something that like the common people, everybody who's not an archaeologist doesn't know. So we kind of
yes, that's right.
Stuck in the perception we had like 30, 40, 50 years ago that, okay, beer started in Mesopotamia and then spread from
Yes, right. Yeah. No, this is a very dynamic time for this. You're right. In the past couple of decades, there are new instrumental methods have become available. People are always innovating on that side. And there's just a lot more efforts to collect this kind of data. So, for example, there's a lot of work on ancient China right now. So we're rapidly learning more about the early days of alcohol production in China.
And that's probably going to be something with rice.
Yeah, it is. In the early days, as with many parts of the world, some of the earliest beverages are often kind of hybrids. They're not just a grain, but they might also have some fruits or some honey or something like that. But I think that if I understand correctly, and I could be missing some of the details, but I think, yes, some of the early beverages in China are definitely using rice. I think there's some early barley, and then definitely later on you get barley, and then over time there is a sort of shift towards kind of purer beverages where they're just making a beverage out of rice, for example, rather than these more hybrid kinds of things. I mean, another interesting thing that they've been working on is trying to understand basically fermentation starters, and so there have been arguments that they have early evidence for something similar to these Chu fermentation starters that are used today, which is a kind of so the beers in Mesopotamia and many of the ones that many of us are familiar with are based on malted barley, malted grains, which is one way of transforming the starches in the grains into fermentable sugars. But another way is to use certain kinds of mold, and so there's an argument that they've found these evidence for these kind of starters in early China, where it's a starter that includes both yeast and these special molds that help with that process of breaking the starches down.
Fair enough. I mean, so that kind of leads to obviously the idea we had in the past, especially it's like maybe beer started in ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, who made it first and all that stuff. It's because we had the written evidence from cuneiform tablets and from hieroglyphic texts and stuff. But obviously, with the new scientific methods of analyzing remains, we find that everybody actually made some kind of beverage.
I think that's basically right. Maybe not everyone, but many people.
Many people. Yeah. I suppose we want to see, like, okay, you focusing on Mesopotamia, in ancient Mesopotamia, which is the land between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris in the Middle East, and they made barley beer there.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of uncertainty about things, but one thing that we feel very certain about is their beers were based on malted barley.
Yeah, and in ancient Egypt they were making beer too, right?
Yes, and also barley and emmer wheat. In both regions were using barley and emmer wheat in their beers.
Yeah. In terms of so basically there's no many differences, but more similarities on the two regions, I suppose.
Well, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think in both cases there's a lot of uncertainty, but definitely clear similarities in terms of, yes, barley-based beers. The one issue is that the kinds of evidence we have from the two regions is very different. So like you said, it's right around 3000 BC and the centuries right before that when we get our first really solid evidence for beer in both of these places. So the timing is also, almost certainly both of them, these traditions go back thousands of years before, but in terms of what we currently know, it's about 3000 BC. And so in Egypt, you have around that time really wonderful archaeological evidence for brewing in particular, where there have been excavated these kind of modular breweries where there's these special standardized kind of brew houses full of vessels for mashing and very large quantities of beer. So the earliest evidence is archaeological like that in Egypt. Then you fast forward a little bit and you start getting really wonderful artistic representations of brewing. So on the walls of tombs, for example, they'll show us people going through the whole brewing process. Sometimes they even have little labels there to tell us exactly what's happening, which is amazing. We don't have that kind of evidence from Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, starting around the same time, there were wonderful representations of artistic representations of drinking beer, but barely anything in the artistic record about brewing beer. But what we do get around 3000 BC is, this is where you have the invention of writing in both of these places, the earliest writing in the world. And quite a few of the earliest cuneiform or proto-cuneiform texts in Mesopotamia are about beer. So from the very beginnings of writing, we start learning about beer in Mesopotamia, and then across the next 3,000 years or so, beer appears in lots and lots, thousands of cuneiform documents. So we have this really wonderful kind of evidence.
What's the word for beer then? The first word that we have for beer?
Well, so in basically we have two main languages in Mesopotamia: Sumerian and Akkadian. In Sumerian, the word for beer is kash, and in Akkadian, it's shikaru. And so in those earliest texts, which are called the archaic texts, they're actually pretty difficult. It's difficult to know exactly what language was being written down. They're not really yet representing all the different elements of speech. I think the consensus, though, these days is that it's almost certainly Sumerian that they're representing. But it's when we get a bit later that we can really say the specific pronunciation of these words, Kash and Shikaru.
Great, thank you. You're listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. So, in that sense, basically, I suppose, we're saying that the Sumerians started brewing back then. And obviously, you said the texts, they don't really tell us about a recipe or how to. It's not a instruction manual on how to make a beer.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think there are people often think that we have something like that for Mesopotamia, but we really don't. We don't have any set of clear instructions that's really like a recipe, like the kind of thing that we're used to. But it doesn't mean we don't have anything. So I guess there are kind of two main avenues here when it comes to texts. There are references in the literary record. So in literature, we have a lot of literature from ancient Mesopotamia, and beer pops up quite a lot, and sometimes references to brewing. Often it's just a few little lines. But the most famous text, called the Hymn to Ninkasi, Ninkasi was the goddess of beer. That's where I got the title of my book. This most famous text, it goes into a lot more detail. And so if you ever hear that there is a sort of recipe or set of instructions, this is what people usually have in mind. But I spend quite a lot of time in my book trying to kind of reduce our expectations for what we ought to be able to get out of that text in terms of instructions for brewing. It's what it is basically a song, and it is praising the goddess of beer, Ninkasi. And the way that it's praising her is basically by showing us little images of her at work in the brewery doing the key tasks of the brewer, because Ninkasi is really mostly depicted as a brewer, as goddess of beer. And so we see her doing a sequence of activities that brewers would have done. And why it's been so interesting is that it at least seems like these activities might be organized in a linear fashion so that we can sort of see the brewing process there. But it is really not a set of instructions. It's these vivid little images. And so it's actually very difficult to use that and solely that to understand how they brewed their beer. But it's really the best thing that we have. So there's that. And then the other kind of written evidence we have is more like ingredient lists, kind of like a proportional ingredient list. And those are super useful. So some of the most interesting ones come from an ancient city called Girsu, dating to what's called the early dynastic period. And they're basically temple records. And the temple was keeping accounting documents that were documenting the ingredients that they were taking in and that were being used to brew beer. So we have some tell us the basic breakdown of, say, 3 ingredients and the exact quantities used to brew certain types of beer. But in a decent number of cases, they also tell us exactly how much beer was brewed with those quantities of ingredients. And we know the type of beer. So there's basically 5 types of beer in these documents. There's a golden beer, dark beer, sweet dark beer, reddish brown beer, and strained beer. So you kind of combine these two. And there are other examples like that across Mesopotamian history, occasional glimpses into the sort of ingredient breakdown for specific beers.
Excellent. That's very fascinating, and gives you like a depth of information about like people drank different things as well. Like they had different kinds of beers. Yeah, not only one thing.
Oh no, they absolutely had all different kinds, and you can kind of trace how those changed over time. During particular periods, they'll have particular ways of talking about beer. So, in that early dynastic period, they were sort of talking about color and sweetness. If we skip forward a little bit in time, you get some that are basically, the names of the beer seem to have to do with the malt content. So they give us numbers, basically. We're going up the scale of malt content, which is probably also up the scale of alcohol.
I see.
And then later on, you get a simplified naming system, which is basically ordinary beer, good beer, and very good beer.
I like that.
And then there's lots of others. You go forward in time, they recognized all different kinds of beers. I mean, one thing that people often say is, the beer would have just been nasty back then. And I mean, sure, it might not have matched up with our tastes exactly, but I always emphasize that these people loved their beers. They wrote songs about it and things. They loved it. They recognized all different types and qualities.
So they would try and make it the best they could, and probably tasted good for them anyway. It
Yeah,
wouldn't
and I
be,
mean
yeah.
different, and there would have been broad range of qualities of beer because basically everyone was drinking beer from the lowest sort of social stratum in the society up to kings and queens, and so there were almost certainly all different sorts of beer for different people.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you that, like, who drank beer basically. So
Mhm.
everybody in the ancient Mesopotamian world drank beer, but it wasn't something that it was associated with certain rituals or festivals, or it was something that was priestly per se.
Well, it's kind of both of these things. I mean, yes, everyone, all different sorts of people drank beer. That's men and women, all different. We know about specific people, specific occupations of all different kinds, like I don't know, construction workers and messengers and prisoners of war, slaves, basically. And then we know about kings and queens and all kinds of elite people. So people across the social spectrum, there's these wonderful events that were basically when the king would go and quote drink beer in the house of a particular person. And this was usually a sort of high-ranking person in the royal court, and the king and his entourage would come, and they would have a special gift-giving party to drink beer in his house. And your question was about kind of like ritual aspects, right?
Yeah.
Like, was there and so it's also that. So and that's another reason to expect that there were definitely all these different sorts of beers. It was very important in the ritual sphere, in particular kinds of temple rituals. A big thing is that in Mesopotamia, the deities were often thought about in an anthropomorphic way. They were like people, and so they had to be clothed, their statues, and they had to be fed every
Right.
day, and they were being fed actual food and actual beer. So there was a constant production of beer just to be fed to the deities. And so, yes, beer was sort of both. It was both a very mundane sort of thing, but it was also fundamental for all kinds of rituals and festivals and feasts of all different sorts.
So yeah, basically the beer wasn't. I mean, today we have bad beer anyway. It's not like we are immune to that.
No,
So yeah, we would have good beer and bad beer and everyday beer and special beer,
that's right.
like we do today. That's great. So your background is you as an archaeologist, and as in your studies, you did a lot about grains and grain storage in the ancient world, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, sure. So that was my PhD. My doctoral dissertation was about grain storage in early Bronze Age Mesopotamia, and so it was basically when I was in the middle of that. So I was already thinking a lot about grain in various ways. That's when I started this beer project back in about 2012, and I came at it in kind of a funny from a funny direction, which was while I was a grad student, another grad student and I had just we had just started looking into Mesopotamian beer when we heard about a collaboration that was getting going between the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago, where we were grad students, and brewery in Cleveland, Great Lakes Brewing Company. And they were going to brew an ancient Mesopotamian beer. And so we basically volunteered. So before I knew very much about the topic, I found myself in the middle of this project trying to actually recreate these beers. So I kind of learned along the way. It was a really interesting way to get thrown into a topic like this.
How was that beer anyway?
Oh, it was great. I mean, this was a multi-year thing. We spent quite a lot of time on it. And then we had a series of 6 or 7 tasting events where we would go to different cities. I would give a talk, the brewers would give a talk, and then we would let people try our beers. It was great. And so the kind of guiding principle behind this project was we were going to try to be as authentic as we could about the whole process. So like authentic ingredients, authentic brewing equipment, and authentic brewing process. There was lots of uncertainty about all 3 of those, but we sort of did our best and a lot of educated guesswork went into it. But so, yeah, and I mean, the beer that we produced on that sort of traditional replica ceramic brewing equipment, it was very different than many of our beers today. But because many people now are comfortable with tart or sour beers, it was people tended to enjoy it because it had that sort of tartness, sometimes a lot more than other times. And so, it was good. One big difference is that they didn't have hops, which is just fundamental for many of our beers now. And so that was a big difference. We would use different kinds of herbs and spices that we knew were available back then. But unfortunately, we don't really know exactly what they might have added to these beers. So yeah, they were flat, so they were not carbonated. They were often kind of milky looking, sort of yellowish, whitish, and tart. And then what we would always do is we would let people try that next to a beer that was brewed using basically the same ingredients, but modern brewing equipment. The biggest difference on the ingredient front was how the yeast was added, so how fermentation was started. For the one on modern brewing equipment, we just use one of their usual kind of Saison yeast strains. But for the more authentic one, we went with a very specific interpretation of one of the ingredients. It's a difficult to understand ingredient called bapier, which we went with one interpretation that this was basically like a dried out sourdough starter that was functioning as the fermentation starter. And so using that as our source of yeast, where it's sort of a mix of yeast and bacteria, that had a real impact on the beer. And so that was, I think, probably the biggest distinction between these beers. We did, I think we came up with some good names. The more authentic one we called Inky Brew, and the other one Gilgamesh.
Of course, you need to have a Gilgamesh beer. I mean, that was like going back, what, 10 years ago? Or no, not so much.
More than that.
More than
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
I think we finished that. We kind of wound down in about 2016 or so. And I actually this year have done another experimental brewing project here in Raleigh, in North Carolina, where I am, which was a lot of fun. We at NC State was the College of Humanities and Social Sciences was hosting a new speaker series, and for our first iteration, they were inviting Alton Brown, kind of celebrity food personality.
Yeah,
and they asked me if I wanted to brew a replica Mesopotamian beer to serve to him, sort of on stage, and so I reached out to a local brewery, Trophy Brewing, and I had already worked with the head brewer there. He did a book event with me actually last year, and we had a great time. And so he was really enthusiastic. So this past summer, we dove back into this, and we also went with that same interpretation of bapier as a sort of dried out sourdough starter. So I spent quite a while in my kitchen just full of sourdough in about 12 or 15 different bowls, going crazy. And we did serve it on stage. We let him try it out of using it through straws from a communal vessel, which was kind of the classic way of drinking beer in Mesopotamia, through a straw. It worked really well.
Ah, fantastic. Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, basically, the classic way of drinking beer was a communal way of everybody sharing it from the same vessel with straws.
Yeah, that's how, especially when they represent beer drinking artistically, we can't always be certain that that's what they were drinking, but the general consensus is whenever they show these communal vessels with people sitting around them drinking through long straws, almost certainly that was beer drinking.
Fantastic.
Sorry. And so we have hundreds of images like that of what are called banquet scenes, where you have people either drinking from these long straws from communal shared vessels, or people drinking individually from little cups that they're holding in their hand. And so, yeah, they don't talk about the straws much at all in the written record, which is really interesting. That it dominates in the artistic record.
Yeah, what are they made of? Like reeds?
So there are some super fancy straws made out of metals like silver and gold and things, but in general, they would have been reeds, reeds were available in abundance. The problem is a reed just doesn't survive well archaeologically. And so we don't generally find those. I wrote about it a little bit in my book. What we do have is these little filters they're metal filters, basically bronze with little holes poked in them. They're kind of finger length, finger shaped almost, kind of conical, little holes punched in them. And they would have been attached to the end of a reed straw. And then that's the end that would have been submerged into the beer to function as a sort of filter to keep any solid matter from getting in. And in some of those little filters are bits of the reed from the reed straws still preserved.
How ingenious. That's great. And I suppose now that's a bit of a tangent, but using different straws will make your beer taste different? Would be better using a silver straw, a gold straw, or a reed straw?
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I haven't tried a gold or a silver straw. It's definitely a different, the straws in general. It is a very different experience drinking the beer than if you're just sipping from a cup. So I've tried several different kinds. So for our first event, we couldn't get any reeds. This was way back in the day. We got some sort of fluorescently colored plastic straws, like neon plastic straws. So I've tried through plastic. Then we got some reeds. And then for this recent event, we actually had some special straws made for us that were blown glass. And so they were meant to look like reeds, but they were glass, which worked well.
How fancy. But yeah, I think that's going to be the most neutral one. Basically, you'll be able to taste the beer as it is a lot more through the glass.
Yes, probably. Yeah, I never thought about this question of whether the material of the straw could impact the flavor. It's a good question.
Great. So you seem to be making beer, ancient beer, like a few times now. Do you find that your technique improved? Like you make ancient beer a bit more closer to the authentic? Does it taste better now? Or you're feeling that there's so many unknowns that we cannot really square?
Yeah, it's interesting. This most recent effort was a lot different than the first one. We didn't actually try to make replica ceramic vessels and things like that. So we were using pretty typical brewing equipment, a relatively simple brewing process. We really poured our attention into this issue of the bapier, this potential fermentation starter. And so I don't know if our beer was radically different, the finished product, but we did put a lot more thought this time, I think, into how to go about drying out this sourdough starter, because this ingredient called bapier, we know little bits about it, but not enough to really get a clear sense for how they made it or what it was. But we know that sometimes it was baked in an oven. And so a big question that this emerged in our earlier effort too is, well, if you make this a kind of dough that you bake in an oven, you basically will kill off the yeast if you really bake it like we're used to. And so it won't function well as a fermentation starter. And so we've ended up in both of these brewing efforts treating this as more like a drying out. But so I tried different methods this time, this most recent one. I borrowed a dehydrator from someone where you can just keep it at a constant 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I tried some in my oven at a very low temperature, but others, and for a long period of time, others I would crank the temperature on the oven way up, but only cook these little loaves or bake them for a very brief period of time to try to create a kind of crust on the outside. But and so that was, I feel like we made some progress on that front in this most recent set of experiments. I also reached out on campus here. We have a bunch of people who come at fermentation from different angles. We have, for example, a bunch of yeast scientists. And so I reached out to them. And so this effort to make a beer earlier this year has actually opened up some really interesting research directions for us. So we're following those up now.
Yeah, it's a multidisciplinary project. You have to take it from all of different angles. Yeah. You're listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. We didn't really mention about your book. So tell me a little bit about your book. What's the name of the book and so on?
Yes, of course. The book is called In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. So I wrote this. It is really intended for a broad audience. That's at least what I was aiming for. I call it an introduction to the world's first great beer culture. And we already kind of gotten into this a little bit, but I do that to, as we talked about earlier, we're learning more and more about the very earliest days of alcoholic beverages in many different regions. But like I said, in many cases, in those earliest examples, all we can get is little bits of information. We can see the presence of these beverages, but we can't reconstruct their whole kind of cultural context. It's when we get to this period of about 3000 BC, where in Mesopotamia and also around the same time in Egypt, we can start to really benefit from a whole bunch of different kinds of sources so that we can really reconstruct this full beer culture. So that was it's meant as an introduction to this world's first great beer culture. And so it is not a book that presents a single sort of unified argument. It's much more trying to introduce readers to all the different kinds of evidence we have, how we approach that. how we reach our interpretations. I guess I've now, I've been doing this now since about 2012, and over those years, I've given a whole lot of talks to all different sorts of audiences about this topic. And my general impression has just been that it's easy to think that when you're speaking to a sort of general audience who doesn't have a lot of knowledge about this material, that they're really mainly interested in our conclusions. I don't think that's right. I think people are very interested in the bigger questions of evidence and interpretation. And I feel like when I give talks to all these different audiences, whether the questions for very general, broad audiences, the questions I get are always just as good as the ones that I get from the academic audiences. And so my goal was to write something that would reach out to that broader audience. And so not avoiding these more difficult questions of evidence and interpretation, but also writing in a way that would help draw people into those, and trying to write in a more accessible and engaging kind of way, but being very clear about here's what we know, here's how we know it, and then here are all the things that we actually don't know for certain. I try to be very upfront about the things that are still puzzles that need to be solved. I try to write in a kind of lighthearted and engaging style. I use a lot of little semi-fictional vignettes where I'll take some particular piece of evidence and use it to sort of take us back in time and reconstruct some particular moment or some particular event, so as if we're there in the past. I also use various kinds of thought experiments to try to help us understand the challenges of dealing with the kind of evidence we have.
Yeah.
So it's meant to be sort of hopefully a fun read for a broad audience.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a really good book. I think I highly recommend
Thanks.
it to people who are drinking beer, or they want to know more about history of beer, or they want to just have a fun read about our past. It's really digestible. It's a very good book to read, basically.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, I mean, here's a question: Why they start making beer when wine as an alcoholic beverage is much easier to achieve? Like, you leave a bit of fruit juice out and it gets.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, obviously, one can, wine production can be very complex, but you're right. It doesn't. The basic process can be very simple, and yeah. So, and just to talk about this difference, people often ask me which was earlier, wine or beer. We definitely don't know. We don't have the evidence, but it does sort of logically make sense that wine would probably have been discovered or invented earlier. Because, with beer, I kind of talked about this earlier, but you need this so yes, if you're talking about wine as basically a fruit that's being fermented, yeah, it doesn't take much. You just sort of break the skin, you got the juice, and you need some sorts of yeast, and it starts fermenting. But with grains, there's a kind of extra step of taking these starches in the grains and transforming them into fermentable sugars. And it's not that difficult for people to have discovered that, but it is an extra step. And often heat is also involved. So that's a little something extra. But so the question, like, why would they make beer is an interesting one. So in southern Mesopotamia, the kind of heartland of ancient Mesopotamia, barley was by far their dominant crop. And if you're talking about grape wine, they did have access to grape wine, but it was mainly coming in from the sort of hillier areas, the surrounding area. And so grape wine was like more expensive import, especially in the earlier, sort of starting at 3000 BC, the next sort of 1,000 years or so. It gradually becomes more and more available. What they did have, though, in abundance was dates. And so they eventually, much later in the first millennium BC, they really start making a date wine. They still call it beer, basically, but it is interesting that they certainly were using date syrup and sometimes using that and maybe dates in their beers, but we don't have good evidence that they were making this date wine earlier, and I don't actually know why that is. But I guess my more general thoughts about why beer when wine is easier, I guess partly it's just that these grains, not just barley, but any of the grains we're talking about, they're very different sorts of crops than fruits. If you're intentionally cultivating them, they have very different kinds of needs and tolerances. They have a very different growing cycle. Their storability is very different. You can't really store up grapes, for example, for long periods of time. You pick them and you make them into wine right away. Whereas barley, you can store it for a good period of time and basically choose when you want to brew with it. So
Yeah.
so in some sense, I think it could be that kind of thing.
Yeah. That makes some sense. Obviously, we know that once you make it and you consume it, it's a nutritious thing as well. It has calories and it's good, for you. So obviously that makes sense. But before we reach that step, is the step. I mean, why you start making beer? Yeah, but yeah, that's
In the question of why people first started making it is a difficult one.
Yeah,
and it's going to be very difficult for us to ever actually see that archaeologically.
No.
We can push that date back earlier and earlier, but in terms of understanding exactly how that happened, how someone first, or maybe many people first discovered this or noticed it, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to ponder, though, all the time.
Yeah.
Something to have on our back of minds. I want to ask you, I mean, I love beer and had a few episodes about beer over the course of human history. So, and I love pubs and taverns and stuff. Do they have that kind of thing in ancient Mesopotamia? Was it something that you would socialize and drink beer with other people? Or it was?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Most definitely.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So, like we've talked about, they were drinking beer. All different people were drinking it, and they were drinking it on many different sorts of occasion. So, in special temple ceremonies and things like that. But definitely, one of the places where you could drink beer was in essentially taverns. One difficult thing is that in the written record from Mesopotamia, a lot of it was produced by scribes who were working for the main institutions, like the state institutions, the temples, that kind of thing. And so when it comes to something like brewing, we learn a lot about that particular kind of brewing happening at that level. We learn a lot less about what was going on in these kind of taverns or in people's homes. And so for the taverns, it's the official record that they appear in the official record mainly where they intersect with the state, because these taverns were generally owned by private individuals, basically. Yeah. So where they pop up is, for example, when they might be paying particular kinds of taxes to the state. Like sometimes they would deliver their spent grain, so what was left over from their brewing, to the state, and it would be taken and fed to pigs or something like that. So they pop up every once in a while like that, and they pop up in some legal texts. So tavern keepers pop up in several of the laws of Hammurabi, for example. But they're not there that often. Where they do show up is also in literature. So the tavern is a regular, and tavern keepers are a pretty regular presence in literature. And interestingly, although we know that there were both male and female tavern keepers, there are words for both, in literature, they really seem to be women. And so we have quite a lot of images of tavern keepers appear quite a lot in literature. We have some archaeological evidence for potential taverns, only a few examples. For example, from a place called Tel Bazi in Syria, where they've done a bunch of organic residue analysis. They basically argue there that almost every house was brewing its own beer, but then there are a few that they think look like basically houses that have been transformed, at least part of them, into taverns. So they are basically divided up into a public space and a private space. And so we get little glimpses of what these might have looked like as physical spaces. They're in just the last couple of years, excavations at the site of Tel al-Hiba, the ancient city of Lagash in Iraq, have also uncovered something that they call maybe a public eatery, maybe a tavern, where they have evidence for, well, there's like a giant oven. There's also this interesting feature that they call a sort of refrigerator. It's it's kind of like one really large jar and another slightly smaller jar inside of it, and between them is packed with little with ceramic sherds, broken ceramic fragments. And they argue that this was a way to keep the liquid in the inner one cool. Then there's another room right next to that where they have hundreds of bowls and sort of beakers found on the floor that they think were once arranged on shelves and benches. And they said that there were a lot of remains of, I assume, sort of residue remains of the food and or drink that was in these vessels. So I'm assuming that we're going to see some really interesting results from there soon. So maybe another kind of tavern.
Yeah. I mean, my question the next question would be something like, how did these taverns look like? But yeah, you kind of answered like it was like extension of the house, the public space of the house. Yeah. It's fascinating to see how similar we are and how these things evolve over such a long period, over the millennia. Basically we always love socializing, and we will find a way to socialize regardless.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's certainly a thing that I tried to do in the book, is to show us both those kind of similarities that we can see deep connections to this early beer culture, but then also to point out the differences, because there's also things that feel very different about their beer culture.
Absolutely, yeah. You're right. Like both things, it's good to see both things, basically.
Yeah, I can say that I end the book by something we haven't talked about. So the hymn to Ninkasi, this text that gives us this image of the brewing process. We only have 3 known examples of it, but every time it appears, right after it appears another text, another song that has been called a drinking song. We don't know if it's exactly what it was, but they're both really great texts. And I've taken one of the lines from the drinking song, and I suggest that we bring it back as a toast, when we're drinking beer ourselves. So the line in Sumerian is Ninkasi zada humu udanti, which means may Ninkasi live together with you. So I suggest that we bring that back as a toast.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Tate, thank you so much for coming to the podcast and telling us all about ancient Mesopotamian beer.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And for people who want to buy your book, I suppose you can find it anywhere online or in all good bookshops?
Yes. I hope so.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Right. And this is it for today's episode. If you found it fascinating and you enjoyed it, then share it, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts or Spotify. If you have any questions or any ideas, or you want to clarify something, do get in touch with me at thedeliciouslegacypodcast@gmail.com, or come over on Blue Sky, where you'll find me regularly posting, or on Instagram. Get in touch, leave me a comment. I'm eagerly awaiting your comments, as I do genuinely learn a lot from you uber clever listeners. And of course, I would like to thank all the old and new Patreon backers and supporters. There's a wealth of gastronomical treasures to discover in the archives of the Delicious Legacy podcast on Patreon, with posts, recipes and musings by me of our historical foods and dishes, plus extra audio content for your ears and only. Okay, my recommendations for this week are Disco Scallops. Yes, you hear it right. This is about how scallops, our delicious bivalve mollusks, are attracted by bright lights, and how this is a more sustainable and ethical way of fishing for them, rather than destroying the seabed and make it totally devoid of any life. Here is the link: www.discoscallops.co.uk. Let me know what you think. The second is from Dark Mountain, an essay called A Spirit Never to Betray. Before tequila and mezcal, there was another drink. David Lauer investigates the fate of a spiky ancient desert plant called sotol and its alliance with generations of artisans who distill a fiery spirit from its heart. And that's dark-mountain.net/a-spirit-never-to-betray. I will leave a link in the show notes, of course. And finally, the final recommendation is the website www.ukrainer.net, a community and organization that has been researching Ukraine and Ukrainian contexts since 2016, telling stories to Ukrainian audiences and broadcasting them to the world in dozens of languages. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy podcast. Merry Christmas and have a lovely time. See you again next week for another archaeogastronomical adventure. I love you more than Gilgamesh loved his bread and beer. Bye!